So we went over the different signs. What would be some of the root causes of these different types of depression? Could you tell me some of those?
Yes, I think, why don't we begin again with the deprived pattern. I think that most people would recognize root causes that have to do with not really receiving enough love from parents growing up, maybe from peers at school, maybe from teachers, so that what we're talking about with the root causes of the deprived type of depression really amount to a lack of attention, a lack of affection, a lack of approval from the people that really should be giving those kind of qualities of love. And as a result, what happens to a person who hasn't been properly filled, so to speak, with this ample love, they develop their emotions in more or less a stunted way, so that they're underdeveloped in terms of the emotions of joy, in terms of the emotions of love, in terms of basically what makes for an abundant life. So instead, you see this picture of despair, of crippling emotionally, of really just a joyless life, a hopelessness. And it makes sense when you realize that being deprived of love is really a very hurtful thing.
That's with the deprived pattern.
Yes.
Now, with the submerged pattern, what would be some of the causes of that?
Okay, the submerged pattern is a little more complicated because what we're talking about is this submerging of anger. So we're talking about anger having been buried alive, and as far as causes of this, we are usually looking at perhaps abusive situations, such as, for example, a person has been emotionally or physically abused growing up, and they're perhaps afraid to feel the tremendous, intense anger, so they bury it alive, because perhaps if they felt the anger, it might jeopardize them receiving love even more, so it's better to hide it. So they can be fearfully submerged. Another possibility for the way the pattern develops is that the person, instead of being afraid of anger, makes believe that perhaps they're not afraid, that it doesn't really bother me. I mean, I'm invulnerable to that kind of offense or abuse. I can survive. It's a little bit more of a bold portrait in the face of being offended. So we're really talking about the submerging of a natural response that a person should have in the face of abuse. So this is definitely a different cause than what we're talking about with deprivation.
Okay, so there's a difference between the deprivation, the submerged.
Yes.
And then you mentioned the third type, the dark pattern, I believe you called it?
Yes, the dark pattern is really, I think I alluded to it earlier, rooted in wrongdoing. So the cause is usually a particular wrongdoing. For example, a person who decides that someone who's offended them really deserves punishment, and it's up to the person who's been victimized to decide how to get even with that person. And so that's one very common causal pattern, that it's a sense of developing revenge. Now, of course, there's also a case where a person who has hurt another person will simply develop this dark pattern because, let's say, he's committed adultery. So that's something very dark, and certainly something that doesn't come out into the light very often. And so adultery can be a cause of the dark pattern.
There's a lot of talk about chemical imbalances and different, as a cause of depression.
Yes.
How is that related to is that related to what you just said about the different types? Or is this something different?
Well, yes, it's related, but I think what we're talking about when people say that their depression is biochemically caused, what they're really saying is that certainly biochemistry can, when it's imbalanced, bring on depressive symptoms. And certainly if you think of the example perhaps of a menopausal woman whose chemistry is changing with that stage of life, that person can actually start to suffer from depression, which has chemical causal patterns. And so this is often what's referred to, I think specifically, more commonly known biochemical imbalance may be talking about certain neurotransmitters in the brain, such as serotonin, that simply are not present in sufficient quantity, and that can lead to depression. And so we have other chemicals, for example, you may be talking about norepinephrine, which is in a chemical imbalance, and that can bring on depression. But the one thing that's important is that people realize that biochemistry can change as a result of the three patterns of depression that I already talked about. So often, biochemical imbalance or changes are actually the result of having a deprived pattern of love growing up, having submerged their anger, or even having wrongdoing that's significant, sinful in their background. That can mess up a body's chemistry.
So if something that was truly biological, not related to the
Yes.
patterns you mentioned,
Yes.
now would a medical doctor be useful for that?
Yes, certainly a medical doctor would be useful, but I think what's important to realize as well is that a professional counselor can also be of assistance, that it's not solely the domain of a medical doctor, because depression affects a person's daily life and social relationships, and a professional counselor can help with the adjustment to changes that are really what depression is about. I mean, if you're having trouble getting up in the morning, the person might need to have some counseling as to how he could perhaps get around that by going on with his life.
Okay, so they could work in conjunction.
Yes.
Now, the different patterns, not the biological, the other patterns, how are they related to each other? Like, and could someone be suffering from more than one at the same time?
Yes, actually, a person can be suffering from the deprived type and the submerged type and the dark type really at the same time. And I think that the deprived type is a particularly important one because it usually develops more early in life, but certainly a person who has suffered from a deprivation of significant, authentic love can also develop the other types.
So there could be a progression from
Yes.
one to the next to the next?
Yes, I think so. If you look at a person's timeline, let's say of their life, their developmental history, you would often see that depression, the first type that develops is often the deprived pattern, then leading into the submerged pattern, because the person becomes so angry at not having love that they bury their anger. Then they might engage in a state of unforgiveness where they become bitter, and then they can have biochemical changes.